Okay, so first of all, I'd just like to make it clear that my primary interest is in practical magic. Yes, I'm an academic. Yes, I suffered doing my PhD in learning ancient Greek, but this was because I wanted it to support my interest in how it actually works. So, why Greco-Egyptian magic? Well, in the Talmud it says that God gave 10 portions of magic to the world, and he gave 9 to Egypt. I don't know who got the other one. And so even the Jews thought that the origins of magic were in Egypt. Now, very quickly, the history is that the Greeks came along and organized the Egyptians because the Greeks had a very scientific way of looking at things. They didn't want anything wishy-washy. They wanted it laid out. They wanted geometry done properly. They wanted all the things that Alexander set up in his city of Alexandria were on a scientific basis, including magic. So historically and very quickly, the magic passed via the Greeks to Constantinople, where it became Christianized, inevitably, and from there to Italy, where it was translated into Latin, Key of Solomon, and from there to England, and the English Key of Solomon, and various other offshoots. Now, the techniques have also traveled the same route. People didn't make up magical techniques. The magical techniques that the ancient Greco-Egyptians used are predominantly just about the same as the ones that we see in the grimoires and the same as the ones we use today. So I'm just going to give you one practical example. The ancient Greco-Egyptians had a procedure for catching a thief and getting your goods returned to you. This procedure, put into Greek, passed through Constantinople, through medieval Europe, and are still used today by people practicing magic. Now, a couple of decades ago, I had a lovely house down in Lewes, Sussex, and a couple of enterprising burglars turned up with a truck and took everything from the house, right down to the bed sheets, everything, even my underclothes. And so what I did was I dug up the catching a thief or getting a thief to return goods, which was a mercurial talismanic operation, and I did it, and of course I did it fairly emotionally, so it was well charged. And the thieves, for some reason that even they couldn't explain, decided they were going to ring me up and ransom some of the stuff back to me. So they did. And the guy phoned me, and "You're what? Oh, you're the guy that stole my stuff." "Yes, he'd like to sell some of it back to me. But you promised not to tell the police." And I said, "No, cross my heart, I won't tell the police." As soon as he got off the phone, I rang the police. And the police went, "Oh, so he's going to meet with you. So we'll send a cop down pretending to be you for the meeting." So they checked through all of the policemen in Sussex, and they couldn't find anybody 6'2", with a full beard, who looked vaguely like me. So they came back and said, "Do you mind acting as yourself?" So I said no. They said, "It's all right, we'll wire you, and we'll be following you," and all that jazz. So to cut a long story short, I met with the thief. He named a huge amount of money to return one of my manuscripts to me, and so I went back to his flat, and after I'd been there a couple of minutes, suddenly the front door burst open, the back door burst open, and the side windows burst open, and there were police everywhere. Bingo, the spell worked. So my point is not that I'm a clever guy. My point is that the technique is still the same. An ancient Greco-Egyptian magician would have used the same thing to have his whatever stolen from him. Okay, so now let's go back and look at what techniques they actually used. The ancient Egyptians were pretty, what's the word, visceral lot. If they wanted to do love spells, they didn't sort of make the girl want to come to them. They performed spells which meant that the girl couldn't eat until she came to the magician, or couldn't sleep until she declared love to the magician. They were quite strong spells. The Greeks, however, took this fairly heavy-duty magic and made a systematic study of it. And so there were magicians who predominantly wrote in Greek, thank God, because I don't read Demotic, who wrote down these spells. Now, the Greco-Egyptian papyri are simply method. There's no theory, there's nothing that explains why or how, there's no history in them, it is just, you want this, you do that. But we've only got Hans-Dieter Bett's translations into English. And because English-speaking academics have a much smaller vocabulary when it comes to magic than the Greco-Egyptians did, the ancient techniques, there were more than 40 different, very specific techniques, were all translated as either charm or spell. So if you read through Bett's, everything is either a charm or a spell, or perhaps an invocation. And you can't tell which is supposed to be doing what. So I went back to the original Greek and discovered that the author of these papyri had actually put subheadings almost. At the beginning of each spell there is a header word or an indication as to what it was. So I was quite fascinated by that, so I went through and started dividing them up, and then I discovered that if you separated out all of the spells for, say, agoge, which is a love spell, and put them together, then they started to make sense. But in the papyri, they're separated with spells for removing fish bones from your throat, and spells for invoking gods or invoking daemons, and it's all mixed up because the magician that wrote it, and the biggest collection, the Theban manuscripts, are written by one guy, was a practicing magician, so he didn't see any reason why he should put it into an order that is readable. So the first thing I did was put it into an order that was readable, and then analyze each procedure to see what was common and what wasn't common, and then figure out how it worked, and then try it out. Those spells do work, and they're useful. But sort of getting into them takes a little bit of work. So that's where my interest came, and then I realized that a lot of the spells and procedures were mirrored in the grimoires and indeed in modern magic. So for example, the ancient Greco-Egyptian magicians did draw a circle on the floor before invoking. It's mentioned in 2 papyri. They did wear a phylactery, which is like a layman in the grimoires. They did do the preliminary invocations, then they did the evocation, they did burn incense, so the procedures are very much the same. Now this means that what we've got here is a technology. A technology is a series of steps that's repeatable and which you get the same results for. So when people say that magic is not scientific, that is rubbish, because science is essentially a method. Try something out, if it works, repeat it again, and it should work again. And if it doesn't work again, you discard it. So the ancient Egyptian magicians did that, and even in the spells, I hate the word spells, they've got things, this has been tried and tested, this has been worked 9 times, and things like that. So you can tell that they actually have just a practical interest in doing it, rather than a theoretical or a sociological interest. Okay, so I'm going to tell you just a few of the types of and as I say, I hate the word spells, procedures, techniques, methods. So first of all, for day-to-day money, the Greco-Egyptian magicians, who are quite often temple priests, moonlighting on the side, would make amulets. Now in modern English, amulets, talismans, defixiones and things are all mixed up. People can't tell the difference between phylacteries and amulets and talismans. So let me just give you quickly the difference. An amulet is something general that you might wear every day to protect you from road accidents, health problems, theft, whatever. So it's a general protection. So they used to make these for money. So there's a lot of amulets in there. And so you were reading through a papyri when you're looking at a serious invocation of, for example, Thoth, and you come to an amulet for preventing, I don't know, whooping cough or other forms of sickness. And you think, what is this guy doing? And what he's doing is he's writing it as he goes. So he gets a job, he produces the amulet, he sells it, and then he goes on to the next thing. And with a papyrus roll, you haven't got the word processor ability to shift blocks of text around. You've just got to keep writing from the beginning right through section by section. So that's why bets is so confusing. Two reasons. One, the 46 different types of magic are not translated except with 2 or 3 words. So you can't tell the difference between the different spells. That's one. Two, it's just in the same sequence as the papyrus is. So in my book I have regrouped the spells into the different methods. So one thing was talismans. One thing was amulets. The next thing is talismans. Talismans are not for general protection, they're for a specific objective. Like winning a horse race, or winning the love of a woman, or something like that. And then 1 or 2 special ones like winning victory. And quite often it was victory in a court case, something which is extremely useful. And in fact I have tried those with court cases, with touch wood, remarkably good results. There are other talismans for binding. Now binding is an interesting word, because binding can be applied to binding people, binding you so that you don't, you're my neighbor, you don't intrude upon my property, or binding you so you don't take my girlfriend or whatever, but also binding spirits. And one of the things that is glossed over in the grimoires is the procedure of binding. Once, as Glendower said in Shakespeare, anyone can call up a spirit. Sometimes you're not even sure whether he's there or not, but the key is to bind him. Once you've bound the spirit, then A, he will come again when called, and B, he will do what you ask him to do. If you just call a spirit, come, 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 and then you say, well, I'd like such and such to happen, chances are it won't happen. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people's evocation spells fail, because they don't do the binding right. Anyway, that's a little side digression into grimoires. Another type of talisman was restraining anger. So obviously there was an awful lot of anger in ancient Egypt, and to be able to restrain somebody's anger towards you is probably a very useful thing. Then you come to the very specialized thing, the phylactery. Now the phylactery is quite often translated just as amulet or talisman, and it's not. The phylactery is something only used by a magician, and it's only used during an invocation and an evocation, and it is only to protect the magician against whatever it is he's invoking. And by that I mean not just spirits, not just daemons, but also gods. The Greeks knew that the gods were a little bit, what's the word, unpredictable, unreliable, or even downright plain vicious. So, with all due respect to the gods, people wore phylacteries to protect them from the rebound at the end of an operation. Sometimes the gods and the daemons don't like to be constrained, so hence the phylactery. And phylacteries are almost always at the end of another procedure, and that's the phylactery that is used in that procedure, but it's not made clear in the papyri. Then there was a very special thing, a deffixione, or a defixio, which is like a talisman but designed to communicate with the spirits of the dead and to get them to do the dirty work for you. Now, they were very popular during the Roman Empire, but after about the 5th or 6th century they faded out, and I'm not sure why. But the procedure of inscribing something, I can see somebody frowning over there, we can argue about that later. The procedure of writing something on a lead sheet and then nailing it, and then throwing it into a deep well or into the sea, or more likely into a grave, that was the standard procedure. This procedure has survived, and you find now in witch practices, in hexen practices in America, people still do the plates and they nail them to the side of their barn. What they don't do is make the connection with the spirit that's supposed to do the work, and then they don't put it in an appropriate place like a grave or the well. So that's an example of a method which is carried through, but some of the detail has been lost. There are other methods where the method has survived but the detail has been lost. Another thing is the example of timing. Timing in magic is very critical. If you want to invoke a particular spirit, You want to do it during the hour that they're strongest in, and you don't want to do it on some random day. You want to pick the day, you want to pick the hour. The Greek manuscripts like the Hygromantia had every single hour of every day of the week tagged to a daemon and to an angel. So they were very precise about that. But the ancient Egyptian magicians said, if you don't give due respect to the god of the hour and the god of the day, then you will be seen as uninitiated, and your chances of the magic working are much less. So timing is important, but timing and the subsidiary invocations to the rulers of the hour and the day are also quite important, and that carries right through to modern times, and that is another reason for, in some cases, failure. Okay, now, written things, like what we've been discussing, there's also divination. Now, we all know about John Dee looking into a crystal. The ancient Greco-Egyptians, they used two things. They used water with oil on the surface, and they used a lamp flame. Now, you can stare at a lamp flame for hours on end, and nothing will happen. Or you can stare at water with oil patterns on the top, unless you're very sensitive, also nothing will happen. Why is that? Because parts of the method have been lost. The original method was you had to invoke a daemon or a spirit at the same time to give revelation to you. And then if you do that, it becomes evocatory scrying, and it works. So when I'd sort of discovered this, I thought, well, I want to go back and look at the full methods with the Greco-Egyptian stuff so that I can improve my practice with grimoire stuff and other forms of magic. And it all does tie up rather nicely. So, let me see. Visions. The ancient Greco-Egyptians liked the idea of seeing gods in visions. This is the most basic form. So they'd invoke the god, then they go to sleep, wearing a phylactery often, and hope that they met the god in their dreams. But the technique that I think is most interesting is the technique of sending dreams to other people, in which the god will tell them something that you would like them to know. And that was rather well developed by the ancient Egyptians. The description of how to do it says, when you send a dream to somebody else, they should appear to receive it from the god they favor most. Given that most of the Western world is Christian now, I suppose you've got to dress that up appropriately to get the message across. Anyway, that's an interesting technique, and that also works. But the ancient Egyptians went further than that. They went to autoptus, which is a face-to-face encounter with the god. Now, I can't describe how that is actually done. You're going to have to read it yourself, because it's quite long and complicated. But to actually, not in a vision, but in waking time, see the god approach you and talk to him. Or at least see him. And then finally, Sistasis, where the god would arrive. Sistasis means the arrival of the god, and you could actually have a real conversation. Now, Alexander of Tralles, who was a physician, found that a lot of the old books on medicinal herbalism didn't work. So he persuaded an Egyptian priest to do a Sistasis ritual for him. And what did he ask to see? He asked to see the god of medicine, Asclepius. And indeed, and he recorded this in some considerable detail and swore to it on a number of occasions in front of the emperor, so I am assuming he was telling the truth. Asclepius turned up and told him, the herbs are right, but they must be plucked at a certain time, and they must be administered in a certain way at a certain time. He went and used that information and became one of the most famous physicians in Rome, and had queues of patients prepared to give him a lot of money because his cures worked. So that's an example of using Sistasis to actually find out some real and useful information. We touched on that. There's about 9 or 10 different methods, most of them fairly cruel to the woman of your dreams. Yes, indeed. She either is kept awake or unable to eat or something or other else until finally she gives up and says, okay, I'm yours. So I don't think I entirely approve. They're not very politically correct rituals, but they're there. Now, there's one category of things in the Greco-Egyptian papyri which is not magic. Most of the magical recipes, mystery work in there as well, and it's more like 240 lines long. It's completely different. And it is, if you like, at a very low level, form of self-initiation. But I think that's not a very good way of putting it. It's a procedure whereby you can talk to a particular god and have his approval and elevate yourself spiritually. Now, people have just, the Mithras liturgy is actually the papyri I'm thinking about, and people have tried to force that into the mold of being a piece of magic, and it's not. It's a completely different thing. It's a mystery operation. I can't really talk more about them tonight, but if there are any questions on that later, I can do that. Necromancy, anybody? Yes, the Greco-Egyptians enjoyed evoking the spirits of the dead to ask them things. My personal view on necromancy is that the dead don't really know very much more than the living, and you might as well ask the living while they're still around. But there may be some special circumstances. And they're also a little bit icky, the necromantic rituals. Daemons, looking at the spiritual hierarchy, you've got the gods, you've got daemons who are essentially the messengers between the gods and humanity. Then you've got lesser spirits, right the way down to really basic ones, and then you've got dead humans. And so in the papyri you have got procedures for dealing with each of these. And one of them is the peridros procedure, and that is designed to get a particular daemon to, I won't say work for you, but collaborate with you, to make it your own personal spirit. And this is a very important procedure, because if you manage to do a peridros procedure correctly, and you get a daemon who is happy to work with you, then a lot of questions can be answered. He can tell you what you should and should, or she can tell you what you should and shouldn't do. So this is one of the things to do first. And indeed, the main procedure for that actually happens in the first papyri in Betz. But that's quite useful to do. The medieval equivalent, of course, is a familiar spirit. If you can get a familiar spirit to do things for you, then this is very good. The Egyptians are very good at breathing life into statues. I don't mean so they could move, but so that they had a certain amount of sentience and you could get answers from them. Then of course there are all the usual things like health. I mentioned earlier in the talk about getting a bone stuck in the throat, and my initial reaction to the Egyptian procedures for health were, ooh, I don't think I want to touch any of those. But, and this is a real thing that happened to me, a friend of mine got a bone stuck in his throat, went to the hospital, they put forceps down his throat, they x-rayed him, they did all sorts of things. They couldn't budge it. So I said, come on, just as a joke, let's try this. And I did the procedure, and one of his friends gave him a whack on the back, and out came the bone. Now, it was probably the whack on the back rather than the procedure, but that's one of the few pieces of medical magic that I've tested from this period. Okay, foreknowledge and memory, the idea knowing things that are about to happen, well, that ties up with divination as well. Improving your memory, this is quite a useful thing. I think, how are we doing for time? That's all I want to talk about, but I hope that you guys have got some interesting questions to trigger off other things. The question was about masonry and whether global magic stems from Egypt. This is quite a tricky question, you realize. Masonry is not strictly magic. It's ceremonial initiation. So it's in fact a little bit closer to the mysteries than to magic, because the outcomes from masonry are not more money, more women, those sort of things. It's not typically magical outcomes. Certainly worldwide, magic is practiced at all sorts of levels. I don't know whether that answers your question. I do understand your position. If you've got a family full of Masons, the pressure to get initiated is quite strong. I've experienced that myself. So let me just summarize. So Russ has actually asked me, what about the promised follow-up volume to this, and also the promised follow-up volume to the grimoires that I've edited? And the answer is yes, I'm working on them. And no, they're not ready yet. The point about these follow-ups are that they are to be step-by-step practice. It will still be complicated. I don't want to dumb anything down. I want to put every step in there so that if you follow it exactly, it will work. Just like, you know, magic is scientific if it's done right. It's only the, well, I don't know, it's only some of the writers who seem to think that it's not scientific. It is scientific because methods have been preserved. What was done 2,000 years ago was done by me 20 years ago, by somebody else yesterday, and so on. Yes, I want to work on these. My point is, though, that I do not wish to write a practical manual unless I've actually done it and made it work. And so I'm accumulating those sections, and it's a big job. So give me time. Okay. So the question was, what's my stance on reincarnation and the ancient Egyptians? So I want to be slightly controversial and say that the ancient Egyptians were not keen on reincarnation. Now by that I mean the purpose of the mummy was to keep the spirit out of incarnation so they could enjoy the summer lands or whatever, enjoy being an Ak and not come immediately back into another body. I'm sure they believed in reincarnation, but their procedure was quite the opposite to, say, the Hindu procedure, which is burn the body now so you get reincarnation very rapidly. The Western attitude of burying the body makes the gap between reincarnations much longer. You can see that I believe in reincarnation. I'm actually married to a Hindu girl, so I have no choice. But apart from that, I genuinely do believe, because I've seen a number of cases where children who couldn't possibly know have known details about what happened. You know, children of this height telling their parents where their previous incarnation was murdered, where the body is, where the two, you know, and so forth. And it finds out to be true. So that works. But the ancient Egyptians had the reverse attitude. They weren't in a hurry to come back here. They wanted to stay. I won't point upwards because I'm not sure where the Tuat is. Maybe it's down, maybe it's up. But they wanted to stay out of incarnation and enjoy the pleasures of that. Anybody else freaked out when I invoked a spirit, and has anything ever gone wrong? Yes, I'm embarrassed to say quite often things go wrong. One of the pleasures of working with magic is to learn step by step. One of my first experiences when I was quite young was far too successful, and I got a grinning head about the size of an orange, gnashing its teeth and staring at me outside the circle. That freaked me out, but I kept my cool and banished it. And that was foolish, because having got it there, I should have said what I wanted it to do for me. But, you know, under moments of stress, these things not so easy to think about. So yeah, definitely yes. And my practice isn't perfect yet. And the trouble is that magic is in fact a broken science. Back 2,300 years ago, they were practicing it, they knew what the rituals were. Quite often in the procedures they say, do the usual. Nobody's told me what the usual is, but I'm gradually putting it together. These guys knew, and they knew what the conditions were, what you should do, and what the signs of something about to go wrong were, and how you fixed it. I'm putting that together still. Christianity, for whatever it's worth as a religion, really devastated magic. So when the Greeks took the magical manuscripts to Constantinople, they were Christianized, and they started writing certain words in code, writing the Greek backwards, using substitution codes, making it very difficult for people like me to read it and figure it out later. And then when it went into Latin, suppression by the church and the fear of being discovered and garroted or burnt at the stake or imprisoned for 21 years, kept them from writing all of the details, particularly with necromantic rituals. So what we have today is a broken tradition, which I am trying very hard to restore. Now, I live, as some of you know, in Singapore, and there's a tradition of Chinese Taoist magic there. And these guys can claim, and I believe they do, 36 generations of magicians who've passed the word on from one to the next. And these guys have got complete systems. And strangely enough, they're a little bit like the Goetia. Like, there are what they call registers of spirits. There'll be 60 spirits or something. And to get an initiation, you're obliged to call successfully and bind each one of these spirits, at which stage your master will go, okay, you passed that one, here's the next lot, and they're more difficult, and so on. Now this is a solid tradition. I can't say I've worked my way very far into it, but I've worked my way in far enough to see the parallels. Because basically spirits are spirits, whatever language they're talking. You know, the same procedure works. It's like chemistry. The ancient Chinese learnt about inorganic chemistry and producing medicines and things in the year 1200, which science has just discovered 30 years ago. But they're the same. The chemistry is the same. And the magic is the same as well. So once you get past the Chinese, and yes, I can read Chinese, but I don't speak it very well. In fact, hardly at all. Once you get past the language, the actual techniques are there, the same. You need to call the spirit. It won't just come. You need to call it, and you need to enforce it to come. Or you need to coax it. Some people prefer to coax it. And then when you've got it there, you need to bind it. Then you need to ask it what you want, and you need to make sure it does it. And then you need to fix it so it'll come back. That's the full method. There you are, guys. I've just told you the whole method. In whatever tradition it happens to be, whether it's a grimoire, a Greco-Egyptian, or whether it's a Taoist magician inside a circle with 28 stones around him, the same technique is used. Timing, very important. Binding, very important. Circle protection, very important. Phylactery layman, very important. All these things, exactly the same in every tradition. So I've been putting together bits and pieces of Chinese magic and seeing where the holes are in our Western practice and filling those holes. So yes, eventually, when I get to the end of this, I'll publish. Any other questions? Okay, the question was that in the Liver of Akai, there are some spells which parallel the ones in the Greco-Egyptian papyri. And can I identify with that? Yes, absolutely, 100%. One of the common daemons called in the papyri, particularly for scrying, is a spirit called Boel, B-O-E-L. And in calling him, you use a black rag, a black piece of cloth, an Isis band around your eyes. That same spell appears in a 15th century manuscript in the British Museum with more detail than in the papyri. They've obviously both come from the same common source. Unfortunately, you never get the original of any of these things, so you've got to work backwards. But that one, the same spirit name, the same method, the same Isis band around the eyes, I can totally identify with what you were saying. Talking about, the question was about the 8th and 10th book of Moses, and it's in the papyri. Yes? Yep. You're not talking about the 8th and 10th. This, just to make it clear, this is not the 8th and 10th book of Moses that was translated into German and which appears in fairly modern magical stuff. Okay, there was an 8th, 9th and 10th book of Moses. The 9th book is fragmentary, parts of it are still in the papyri. So I figured out where they were. Unfortunately, what the Theban magician has done is he's just taken parts and he hasn't transcribed the whole thing. The key is the key is the 9th book of Moses. Okay. The 9th book of Moses has two things in it. One is a particular incense to be used, and my memory cannot produce that immediately. And the other was timing, which is just emphasizing what I was saying earlier about timing. It's very frustrating that he talks about the key, but he doesn't produce the key. Somewhere in the same vicinity of papyri, there is bits which I believe were the key, and they're talking about the hours to a large extent, and a particular incense, and also about beans. So if you know about Pythagorean theory, they had a big number about beans. You weren't supposed to eat them. I can't really do this at the moment, but yes, it's very sad that this is incomplete. just talking about, I'm going to tell you a secret. I shouldn't, but I'm going to tell you a secret. Most of these papyri, particularly the ones that are very good and solid, rather than just the scrappy bits of amulets and so forth, came from a tomb probably near Thebes, and they're found by a guy called Anastasia, who carelessly sold bits to one museum, Leiden, another bit to London Museum, another bit to a private collector, and so forth. And it's only lately that scholars have sort of put them together. Okay, so that's a core thing. But most of the magical papyri were kept in the temples. One of the Roman emperors, it wasn't Diocletian, it might have been Hadrian, I can't remember, ordered that all of the magical papyri should be collected from every temple in Egypt. This is a political thing, so that the Egyptians couldn't use magic against their Roman governors. Very smart move on his part. He had them collected together and he had them deposited in one particular place in Egypt and sealed. Now, I've been researching this and I have found out where that place is. I can't share that with you at the moment, but if I can possibly persuade somebody to dig it up, then maybe we'll have a lot of other answers. Had very concrete objectives. Spiritual objectives are not part of it, except in the case of the so-called Mithras liturgy and two other passages. Did the Greco-Egyptians use positive and negative forms of magic? The short answer is no. They were practical. They didn't take a moral distinction between how you do something. It's do you get it or do you not get it? In fact,
sort of
no. Very strangely, there's no spells in there for getting lots of money. So I can either assume that all these magicians were well heeled, as indeed every magician should be, or a couple of nervous laughs in the audience there, or that a lot of them were temple priests and therefore hadn't much need for it. But very strangely, there are no spells for acquiring money. Acquiring women, yes. Acquiring daemons, personal daemons, yes. Talking to the gods, yes. But in a way, not really the same objectives as a lot of modern magicians have. You know, like getting a job. This was not one of their objectives. Okay. Which was mentioned on the web of evoking Malthus by an African magician who, by the sound of it, wasn't sufficiently skilled, finished up on his back in the circle choking. Now, the easy answer is that he obviously did it wrong. The more complicated answer was that if he finished up suffering inside the circle, then he definitely hadn't done the circle properly and he wasn't wearing any kind of protection. But he was obviously good at evocation rather, because Malthus, or one of his legion, has obviously turned up. He was sort of saved by somebody else in the circle. Normally, if you have a scryer in the circle, it's not the scryer's job to save the guy doing the invocation. It's the invoker's job to deal with the spirit, and the scryer's job is to see what he can see. When evoking spirits, there's two basic ways of doing it. One is simply into a crystal or into a scrying media so that you can see and communicate with it, and the other one is to keep it outside the circle where it's not going to interfere with you at all, which is the much more sensible way probably of doing it. Okay?
Yeah, I just want to put him in danger.
Let me answer that. Your friend in the circle will be in no more danger than you are. If the circle's done properly, that will keep them back. It seems very weird that something drawn on the ground and consecrated will actually keep an entity back, but it will if it's done properly. So you no need for, as long as your friend doesn't put their elbow out of the circle or dash out of the circle to have a quick glass of water or something, in which case they bring it on their own head and that's too bad. As long as they don't do something stupid like that, they will be safe. And it is always good to have somebody with you. The more you know, you need room to move around. Some people ask me, can you do a 6-foot circle? And my answer is basically no. Certainly not if you've got somebody else there. Minimum is 9-foot radius, and 9-foot diameter, and I use a 9-foot radius circle, which gives me plenty of room. Okay. Did the Egyptians feel they needed protection? They didn't need protection from negative intentions, but they needed protection from spiritual creatures who, even the gods and goddesses, could be quite negative. And that protection would be personal and also on the ground in a circle. So an Eye of Ra would be quite a good thing as a general protection indeed. They would certainly, if it was an Egyptian spirit, would certainly understand that. But in the papyri they give specific phylactery for specific operations. So if you're dealing with Typhon Set, it would be a different sort of phylactery. And the best procedure is to use what they suggest there. But yeah, certainly an Eye of Ra would be good general protection. So, yes. What is the relationship between... is it the same spirit that was invoked 2,300 years ago or last week in Singapore? Well, if you call, let's use a real example, Boel, nowadays the reaction will be very similar to what the ancient Greco-Egyptian got when they called Boel, the same spirit. If you're going to ask me the theology, is it the same spirit and is it still alive? I don't know. Is it the grandson of the same spirit? I don't know. Is it just a name, label, and some abstract force behind it? I don't know. I tend to think of them as individuals, and I tend to think of them as the same individual, simply because then it doesn't clutter my head up with all sorts of worries. I just treat them as if they were the same individual. There are some classic texts where demons have said, our name is Legion, meaning we have plenty of different names, and that is also possible. If I can draw a modern parallel, when spiritualists are using a Ouija board, they get the spirit of, I don't know, Athanasius Kircher. The spirit says he's Athanasius Kircher. You know pretty certainly that he's not. So certainly with dead humans, spirits will often imitate them. Is it good Uncle Bob? Yes, the spirit says, I am Uncle Bob. So I'm not very keen on Ouija because it's a bit imprecise. And again, if you're talking to dead humans, you might as well talk to live humans. They don't know very much more. But leaving the humans on one side and the dead humans on one side, spirits, I tend to find that the same name calls the same sort. So Sesingen Par Pharangis behaves the same way today as he did in the papyri, for example. Have I seen any similarities between traditional African tribal magic and ancient Greco-Egyptian magic? The answer comes back to what I was saying before, that the magical techniques are the same across different cultures but with different names. There's a lot of African tribal magic which has parallels with Gaelic magic, whether it was passed down through grimoires via the hoodoo voodoo people in the southern American states, or whether it was a more direct transmission, I don't know. I would certainly say that a lot of the tribal magic in West Africa came from Islamic sources, and the Islamic sources don't seem to me to link up very well with the Greco-Egyptian. Okay.